and welcome to Kojo's Corner. This is season 2, episode 3, and this is our special Black History Month edition. So for Black History Month, I've been interviewing Black women, and we're leading it into March, which is also International Women's Day and International Women's Month. So we started off with MPP, independent MPP Sarah Jama, and followed by Trustee Dahab, Sabreina Dahab, from Ward 2 in Hamilton. And I think before we pass it over to Sabrina, I think I mentioned this at the Black History Month launch for Hamiltonians. I know people will remember Lincoln Alexandra as the first MP, but in 2024 we can say we have a black trustee, we have a black MPP, and a black MP. So, happy Black History Month and happy Black History Year, because I know once March sets up, then everything is like all Black history stuff is gone, but it's never gone. So today we have Trustee Dahab with us, going to talk to us about some of the things she's working on, some of the things that are critical. You've been in office since 2022. You are close to halfway in your term. So I think it'll be great to hear from you. So, welcome, Trustee Dahab. Is there any introductory comments you want to make before we get into it?
Yeah, no, happy Black History Month, everybody. Thanks for having me. I was thinking about the show and I was thinking about the name. And I think Kojo's Corner is such a great name for a podcast, by the way. But yeah, I'm excited to have a chat about education, to talk a little bit about the role of the trustee, because I often find that even now I'm still having to explain to people what trustees do, how to navigate the system, things like that. So yeah, I'm just excited to have a good chat. I think there's a lot of things happening in education, and I think education is like infiltrates a sort of like every single institution. I think we all have a stake in building a strong education system. So yeah, I'm excited to have this chat.
So you're a trustee for Ward 2. What are the boundaries for
Yeah.
Ward 2, and what are some of the schools that are under your purview? Because that's another thing that maybe the general
hmm
public might not know.
Yeah, that's a good point. So trustees are elected every municipal election. So when you go and vote for your mayor and for the city councilor, you also vote for trustee on the exact same ballot, and your trustee is the representative for the school board. And the way it's split up is the same way as city councilors are split up. So the boundaries are the same. And so so I represent Ward Two. So the schools in Ward Two are Dr. Davy, Queen Victoria, Beneto, Hess, and Central Elementary. So those are all of the schools in my ward. Ward Two doesn't have a high school, which is a huge concern for a lot of families. We used to have a high school until it was shut down, and that was Sir John A. Macdonald, which was shut down back in 2017. Um, so yeah, those are the boundaries. But we also know that because of the way catchment policies work, we do see some students who might not necessarily live in the ward but still come to schools in the ward, and students who also live in the ward but attend high school in another ward, either Ward One or Ward Three, because of again catchment, because of lack of schools, and things like that.
So, thanks for that geographical explanation. So, let's say we have a parent, their kids go to Westdale or Benny Custers. If an issue happens, are they reaching out to you, or are they reaching out to the trustee, the respective trustee in that area where the high school is?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think about that all the time. But I'm going to step back before I answer that question and explain the role of trustee a little bit more, because I think that might help us answer this question. I think the role of trustee primarily is to be an advocating voice, an advocating person for parents and students in the ward. So we don't spend a lot of time in schools necessarily. We don't spend the regular Monday to Friday school day in schools. We are mainly kind of focused on governance, so kind of like higher level school board level stuff. So we have biweekly meetings where we um, see different policies, different like specifically to Hamilton based like legislations that we want to pass, any policies we want to see implemented in the schools. We also sit on a lot of committees. So um, I personally sit on the policy committee, I sit on the human resources committee, and I sit on the programming committee, which are all mandated by the province. Um, and those are committees where we see the respective material kind of addressed. So whenever we have like an HR related matter, we see it at the HR committee meeting, and that's where I have the opportunity to ask questions, to make suggestions, to raise concerns that community might have about a specific issue. And then we see it again at the public board meeting, which happens Monday nights biweekly. And all of these meetings are public except for sessions where we're dealing with private or in camera stuff. So when parents have concerns, um, often trustees are the first person they reach out to because they don't know who else to talk to. Because the way the school board is set up across this province actually is not super accessible. People don't really know who to talk to. So if you have like a concern at school, the chain of commands is supposed to be your teacher. If the teacher's not addressing it or there's a concern with the teacher, you're supposed to reach out to the administrators at the school. So your vice principal or your principal. And if you're having issues there, it's supposed to be the superintendent. And if you're having issues there, then it's the director. Um, and the role of the trustee, my role specifically in that, is if a parent comes to me with a concern, is I will help them navigate those, making sure they know who to contact, making sure they know what they need to know going into that meeting or that conversation. So I've heard from students across the ward. I think trustees represent wards, but when we're in a board meeting, we're actually representing all students because when we're passing policies, I'm thinking about every single student in our board in mind, not just students across Ward 2. And so I have heard from parents across multiple wards in the school board around specific concerns, and I've just been able to redirect them, help them figure out where to go next. Um, and I've always been happy to do that. I know this also happens for other people. Sometimes somebody might just know a trustee personally, and so they'll reach out to them about a specific issue. And unless it's like ward specific to deal with a specific issue at a specific ward, this is generally okay for another trustee to help navigate or redirect them to the ward trustee.
Mhm. You mentioned a word that I think maybe listeners or parents generally do not know, which is the superintendent. I think
Mm-hmm.
vice principal, principal, teacher, they're familiar with those terms. So can you expand on what the role of the superintendent is?
Yeah, totally. So a superintendent basically, so we have, I don't know the number at the top of my head, but we have superintendents who are responsible for what we call a family of schools. So there's a family of schools 1, family of schools 2, families of schools 3. I think we have 5 families of schools. And then those are just schools across the school board. They're not specific to wards actually. There are multiple superintendents within my own ward. So there's a superintendent for Queen Victoria and a different superintendent for another school. Um, and superintendents are basically, you could see them as just the higher up of a principal. So it's just, yeah, basically the person in charge of the principal would be the superintendent. I think the simplest way to put it in like a chain of commands type of understanding. Superintendents also have other portfolios as well that they work on, including like equity, including like the calendar creation, including suspensions. So they also have a bit more like portfolios that do extend just dealing with the day to day school stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah, and they're also not in schools every day. They do come on like a needs basis. They're there to support the principal in anything kind of happening at the school.
Hmm. So now that we know, we know what a hopefully what a trustee does and their role, and those that are watching, I highly encourage you to go and find out who your school trustee is, and just for again our listeners, uh, Trustee Dahab is for the public
Mm-hmm.
school board. We also have a Catholic school board, we have a French public and French Catholic, and all of these different boards, school boards have their own trustees. So depending on where your child goes, please make sure you know who the respective trustee is. So now that we know, can you tell us, you've been in office for a year and a half, close to 2 years. How has that gone, and what are some of the
Mhm.
priorities that you are looking forward to working on, um, uh, in the next 2 years or so?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm gonna add one more thing a little bit before I answer that question about the role of trustees, because I think it's important for community to understand this. Is that the board of trustees, I would say, is probably the most accessible place that parents can push forward to advocate around issues that they're having in the system. We have seen motions come out of community advocacy. We have seen like policy change coming out of parents advocating, and that has all come at the board of trustees. And what we're kind of seeing happen to the education sector across this province um, is really scary. And we need a board of trust. We need boards of trustees across this province that are ready to defend public education, but also demand education that looks different, that is more inclusive. So it is really, really important to look and to know deeply who your trustee is, and to make sure that if they're not advocating for you, next time the election comes around, make sure that there is somebody who's running who is going to advocate for you and your family and for the students who are most marginalized in your system. In terms of, yeah, kind of what I've been able to do or what I'm working on, it's been about a year and a half in the role, and it's been a huge learning curve. And there's still a lot to learn about kind of how a lot of these processes work. But I think some of the stuff I've been able to work on initially was around pushing for more COVID precautions in schools, so specifically around masking. Um, there's also a lot of work done in collaboration with community. I will say that anytime I've been able to put forward a motion that has passed and has been successful, it's been the result of like tireless and intentional and like incredible advocacy on behalf of community, on behalf of students, on behalf of parents who are fighting for a better education system. And I think that we see this all the time, and specifically around the advocacy that community did for suspension and expulsion data that was desegregated. Um, we know that in Hamilton, up until last year, we did not have any suspension and expulsion data that was disaggregated that was showing us patterns and trends. But what we had been hearing from community was that young kids, was that Black students, was that Arab speaking students, or Arab students were being suspended at disproportionately higher rates than other students in the system. We were hearing about violations, human rights violations in those processes as well. And community had been pushing for a really long time for this data. And so we saw community kind of show up to one of our public board meetings. We saw we heard from parents who delegated about their own experiences of unjust suspensions, and how these processes, how we need to rethink whether or not suspension and expulsions are actually doing what we want them to do, and why, why that is. Why aren't we seeing decreased numbers of, quote unquote, violent instances in schools when we are suspending kids? It's something for us to think about in our schools. And yeah, I put forward a motion that passed unanimously that evening for the school board to begin collecting disaggregated suspension data. And when the data came back, it showed us everything that community had been telling us around who was being suspended, why they're being suspended. And this is the beginning, I think, for our board to really think about our processes. Um, to think about who we're suspending, who we're expelling, and why these disproportionalities exist, because we know it's not differences in behavior. We know that there are biases in these processes. And this is also not something that is unique to Hamilton. This is actually something we see across this country. The
So
very nature.
so
Yeah.
yeah, and I just put this up. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah.
This
Hmm.
just came out of Halton,
Yeah.
and it was very interesting because I would say basically you set the standard, or you have, in working with community, you have opened the discussion around data collection around suspensions. So again, this just came out. Halton Catholic,
Hmm.
same results. Um, And I think even in their case, there was some question about they didn't release all the data as Hamilton did. So sorry to interrupt. I just wanted
No,
to
that's okay.
make that point and show our listeners this is just this week, February 26,
Mm-hmm.
2024, and you were
Mm-hmm.
working on this last year.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of school boards who have yet to sort of release this type of data. We do know that TDSB has, a couple of the larger school boards across this province have. Um, but I know TDSB has been collecting race based data for over a decade. This is something that's pretty new for us in Hamilton, and I know there are school boards who don't yet collect race based data. Um, so, yeah, I think it's a conversation we need to keep having, but also kind of, we know this is happening. It's not like this data is telling us what we don't know. This data only kind of, yeah, I think for a lot of people in community, they're not surprised when they see this data. You know, I know people I've spoken to are not surprised because they know this is real. I think what this data does then for us as an institution is show us the trends, where this is happening, where we need to invest more work in, um, to begin to tackle this and make sure that this isn't happening. And this also includes things not only that are related to how we expel and suspend kids, but in people don't really think about all of the other factors that play into suspension and expulsion, specifically for marginalized communities. So, for example, like uh, access needs, like lack of language barriers, I think about a lot, and how that also has resulted in disproportionately higher suspension and expulsion rates for racialized immigrant families who can't advocate for their kids. So there's a lot of different layers of this to begin to address this that aren't as simple as just like training. Um, but does require that we take like a holistic approach and analysis to how this is happening across the school board. And lastly, I'll say about this is that um, the inherent nature of discipline policies in schools are rooted in racism. They're anti-black, and this has been since the inception of these policies. They have existed to uphold and maintain codes of conduct and school board policies and like ministerial level policies that are foundationally Eurocentric and colonial in nature and force students into a specific mold of what it means to be a good student, and it's often super racist. And so these numbers are not surprising, but just something to think about at the policy level. We need to think about what happens when we are pushing kids out of our schools.
Mhm. So then let's segue then into support for our public education system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Where are we? Because there's you are talking about what are the access accommodation needs of students, and that could be a wide variety of things, teachers, supplies, different models of teaching, pedagogy. Where do you see our public education system like in 2024 under the current government?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of good to say about sort of the direction that public education is heading under the current leadership of the conservative government. I think this is also something, though, that unions have been ringing the alarm bells on for decades now. The trajectory that public education is heading towards is one that is dangerous, is one that is privatized. And I think what we've seen happen with this conservative government, and unions have been talking about this a lot, is sort of a manufacturing of a crisis. You know, in the same way we talk about the starving of the healthcare of really necessary life saving resources. We see the same thing happening in public education. You create a crisis by underfunding the education system for decades. Um, you once you create a crisis, you come back and say that the only way to solve this crisis is by relegating parts of education to the private sector. It's the neoliberal playbook. It is what always happens when we see institutions that are public kind of be attacked. And we see this in a lot of ways. I think there's been a lot of conversation at the ministry level around back to basics, you know, and back to basics rhetoric is actually it's a pretty common conservative talking point every single time that communities, unions, students demand education and learning spaces that are well funded, that are more inclusive, that actually meet needs of students, that are more holistic. Um, yeah, and we see this when the provinces challenge on things like curriculum and education policy and legislation. They'll accuse the education system of leading kids in the wrong direction, of teaching kids the wrong things, of not focusing on what's important. And this is usually when parents are demanding, again, like more inclusive pedagogies. We're seeing attacks on critical race theory in education, inclusive education spaces, anti-racism, anti-oppression in education. And the only way to quell all of this is by manufacturing a crisis and relegating it to the private sector. And quelling anything that challenges, again, the Eurocentric and colonial structures of public education in this province and this country. Yeah.
What when wait, so we've you mentioned the back to the basics. Can you let's give us examples, because I think sometimes the on our show here, yes, there are the labels that are out there, but we want to drill into, give us specific examples of, like, when the government is saying back to the basics, but then it's actually of a way of underfunding the public education system. So can you give us, like,
Yeah.
a couple of examples?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot about what happened during the pandemic, and I think we're hearing the rhetoric around back to basics, specifically post pandemic, quite a bit. During the pandemic, many students didn't have access to the resources they needed to complete schooling online at home. They didn't have computers, they didn't have Wi-Fi, they didn't have what they needed to their materials to engage in school online. And what we saw happen then is sort of when kids were coming back, teachers were citing lower academic grades based on standardized testing, which is also a different kind of issue, which we can unpack at a different time. Um, but what we're seeing happen is the government talking about needing to invest in maths and the sciences. But during the pandemic, a lot of kids who were engaging in school were technically engaging in the basics. What students did not have during the pandemic is access to extracurriculars, access to nutrition programs in schools, access to friendships, access to supports and supportive adults. And those are all things that research tells us um, are necessary to the success of students. It's not just about what students learn in the classroom, it's also about all these other facets of education that make students successful. And so instead of investing money into like nutrition programs, for example, or into more EAs, more supports for students, smaller class sizes, to actually support students as return in the middle of still an ongoing pandemic, we are seeing kind of this rhetoric around back to basics. We have to rule out any of this critical race stuff because this is what is harming the kids, when in reality, it is the chronic underfunding of the education sector.
Yeah, yeah, and um, it's yeah, like you mentioned this, it's like um a difficult, or like a troubling um scene, right? The government is responsible for public education, fund it, they won't fund it, and they'll complain about it, manufacture something and say, see, it's not working. So let's do X, Y, and Z. But they are the ones that are in control of it. And I think we can see even the same parallels in healthcare, which again affects
Yeah.
education. So when we see a government that is underfunding public education, support for teachers, educational assistance, supplies and equipment for students, online learning, mental health, all of these things, then where does that leave you as trustees, and where does that leave parents and families and children that are going through the system.
I mean, here's another example I'll share. Sir John A. Macdonald in War II has sat empty since 2017. You know, it's not because the school board does not have plans for the site. The school board has plans to and wants to build a school on that site, but the ministry is refusing to approve the plans to build on that site. And this is not just unique to Sir John A. Macdonald. This is like there are accounts of boards across this province that the Ministry of Education won't approve builds for schools. You know, we are seeing a lot of schools that are crowded, classroom sizes that are extremely large. Schools are having to buy more portables because schools are over crowded, and the ministry won't approve builds for new schools. And so what this means is that this is disproportionately impacting students who are most impacted, who live in inner cities, who are poor, who are racialized and marginalized. And what this means is at the board level, either we think about creative ways to meet the needs of our students, while also recognizing that we're up against legislation, and put up a fight against this province. And I think that the trustees across this province need to start having a conversation about um, watch what is going to happen as we watch the education sector crumble in front of our eyes and sit there and not be able to do anything. You know, we've sent letters to the ministry that have been ignored. Letters aren't working. You know, what else can we as a trustee body, or can OPSPA do, the Public School Board Association, also to demand um, that the province start investing in public education?
Mhm. You know, I have an idea. This idea, I think I mentioned this during the 2022 election, and I said, you know, I think municipal elections and provincial elections should happen at the same time. You
Mm,
know why?
mm,
Because when you separate trustee elections from a provincial election, when you know that the province is responsible for the education, now you can't have that conversation, right? So even in the next provincial election, the discussion of education, it's like a periphery discussion. It's not like what are you going to do to fund this, what are you going to do to do that. And maybe that might bring some form of accountability to the province
mm.
in terms of what they need to do to ensure that they are really funding public education. But hey, what do I know? um
That's a lot of door knocking, Kojo.
so let's move on to students. I
Yeah.
think you're a former student. For folks that don't know, Sabrina, you fought for um, specific things that needed to be available for students, and now you're a trustee. How are you supporting students, and what would you say, what are some of the key challenges that students are facing right now in Hamilton?
Yeah, honestly, what I will say is that the best part of this role is every time I get to hang out with students, I get to talk to kids, I get to visit schools. So one of the other things I get to do as a trustee is attend parent council meetings. So every time parent councils are meeting, I try and stop by when I can to check in, see what folks are working on, what folks need, what I can bring back to the board. Also get to go to school sometimes when there are events. Bring congrats to during commencement ceremonies, and see kind of like the day to day of kids in schools. That's always the best part of this, is hanging out with the kiddos. But I think there's a lot of challenges many students are kind of are facing across this province, and I think one of the cool things about being rooted in community, which I try and be accountable to all the time, is that a lot of youth just like send me a DM on Instagram every time they have a question about a school board related thing, or are looking to connect with a trustee, or have questions or a concern that they want help navigating, you know? I think one of the things I have really tried to prioritize in this role is to be as accessible as possible to parents, to students, and to people who need support navigating the system, the education system, which means, yeah, sometimes I get DMs on Instagram and Twitter. And that works for the young ones, and that works for the youth in schools, and that works for me too, right? And so trying to be accessible in that way, trying to really hear and see and listen to students when they share concerns, and center students in advocacy, right? So whenever we have an issue that students want to work on, I always invite students to come and delegate to the board of trustees, walk them through the process, bring them into our space, because oftentimes we are making decisions on behalf of students and aren't always hearing from students. And I think this is
Mhm.
why the student trustee role is so important. And what I think student trustees have always done really, really effectively is center the student voice and bring students along the way. Um, yeah, I think one of the things we're dealing with right now in schools is lack of access to mental health supports. Um, that students are talking about, one of the things we're dealing with right now, and I think the elephant in the room, and in a lot of rooms, is the ongoing occupation in Palestine and how that's affecting students in the education sector. Our schools are microcosms, and so I think that that means that the things that are happening outside will infiltrate the school system and impact students there. And what we're hearing from students in Hamilton, but also across the province, is levels of censorship, high levels of censorship, a lot of like threats to disciplinary measures for trying to have conversations about the ongoing occupation in Palestine and how that's impacting the well-being of students. You know, students in our systems have just watched on their Instagrams, on TikTok, on Twitter, like the brutal massacre of thousands of people, over 30,000 people, and the displacement. And we're talking about students who are Palestinian, students who have families back home, Muslim students, students who are allies, students who want to support Palestine, deal with a lot of censorship. And the threats of discipline for wanting to talk about this. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is, what kind of system are we creating if we can't even let students engage with world issues in ways that are meaningful and in ways that think about how we build alternative worlds? You know, 10 years from now, are we going to be teaching about the genocide in schools, that, like, the ongoing genocide right now? Is that going to be part of the curriculum 10 years from now? You know, and will we then be too late to have conversations with change makers, with young students in our system who are going to go on into this world? What impact is it having that we're censoring those conversations on their well-being, on the well-being of their future, and also on the world we want to build? And so that's one of the biggest challenges I think I've been hearing a lot about now. Students in Hamilton are organizing a march at the school board actually next Friday. It just went live last night. I just saw it, demanding an end to the censorship. Um, and it's deeply troubling for me as a trustee to know that this is still happening. We tried to put forward a motion, and I know that sometimes this stuff takes time, and I know that there's work behind the scenes to begin having this conversation. But it's hard to know that students are dealing with censorship, um, and are having to resort to walkouts, are having to resort to leaving classrooms, to leaving their educational spaces, to demand better from our institution.
So you mentioned the motion. Not everybody might have the information.
Yeah.
That happened last year, right?
Yeah, it was November.
November,
I think it
yes.
was towards
So
the end of November.
yeah, can you walk us through how the motion came to the trustee table? Because I think that's
Yeah.
that's important about how it came, and what was decided and what that means for what's happening next week.
Yeah, for sure. So back in November, or kind of starting in October, we had a lot of students reaching out to myself and to the student trustees as well, kind of talking about what their experiences has been like, hearing a lot of stories of Islamophobia, stories of anti-Palestinian racism. Students were trying to fundraise for Gaza, and to just like send some aid there, and were being told they weren't allowed to. And these are all public stories. Students dealing with censorship, students wanting to talk about how they're feeling, how they're doing watching this genocide, talking about what their families are experiencing and not being allowed to. And so students were demanding, uh, yeah, change. And students were also dealing with not being allowed to wear the kufiya in school. There was someone was talking about how you weren't allowed to wear keffiyeh in school, and that was banned in our school board, which is not. But just a lot of barriers, anti-Palestinian racism, Islamophobia that students were experiencing, and so um, working with the student trustee Lynn, he put in a lot of work, and student trustee is the other student trustee Harry Wan, to talk to students, their stories, their experiences, and we drafted a motion together, which was asking for anti-Palestinian racism training for all staff, Islamophobia training, as well as an update to our dress code policy to make it very, very clear that students are allowed to wear their keffiyehs in school, and also an update to our fundraising policy to make sure that educators, that principals, vice principals, teachers know um, that students are in it. It is in line with our fundraising policy for students to fundraise for humanitarian issues that are global, local, provincial, whatever that be. And so we brought forward a motion. We had some students delegate. We had 3 students delegate, and they spoke about what's happening in their school. Um, and yeah, the motion passed unanimously that evening. And so there's work now behind the scenes to try and get that motion actioned. Um, and at that time, also, we had seen students across, maybe it was, I can't remember the number now, but 7 or 8 high schools in Hamilton all host walkouts. And this was something that was happening across the province as well. Students were coming out demanding a ceasefire, demanding an end to the occupation, and also demanding that that the education system have a serious conversation about what is happening in Palestine. Um, so yeah, and so students are coming back next Friday to the school board um, because they feel like they're not being heard, um, and demanding an end to censorship in schools.
Mhm. You know, yeah, I student voice very important. I think I look back, student voices are always what change institutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Student voices are what push real I don't like that term change, but like that's what make that's what allows institutions to do the correct thing. So yeah, it, I last our last episode we had MPP Jama on the show, and this week you are on the show. One thing that has struck me, and I don't know that maybe people give you an MPP Jama credit for this, and I see this um and I want to highlight it and maybe get your responses, that I would say, and people will hear this and maybe think it's controversial or think it's out of place, but I would say I've never seen any politicians or elected officials work with community, in your case work with students, to bring motions and changes forward, right? On the show with MPP Jama, work with the a coalition to bring social assistance reform. And she also mentioned that she's doing some work with to address air quality here with community members. So why do you think, or why do you center the collaboration with students and bringing that voice to the board table? Like,
Mm-hmm.
maybe, I mean, it might be evident to me, but I still want to hear you say why.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is important? Because you've done this not just once, but you've done it multiple times, and that is the kind of uh, uh, black women political theory action that we are seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, what is the point of me being in this role if I'm not going to champion and bring along the students who I'm supposedly supposed to be working for? You know, what purpose do I have in that seat if I can't even do the simple thing of bringing students along, of showing students how these processes work, of teaching students how to organize and how to mobilize and how to fight for the issues that they believe in, right? Like, I dealt with this experience when I was in high school in Hamilton, and as I left high school, kind of organizing around education based issues in the city. where we didn't have any representation on the board of trustees, right? And I think a lot about the difference it would have made for so many students back then if there was even one trustee who had believed and who had heard the experiences of students in schools. Um, and so from that perspective, I think that it's important to center the voices of students, but also like, what are we doing differently, right, to make sure that these systems are responsive to the needs of students? We know these systems have not worked for us for a long time. We know these systems have caused us harm. These systems have alienated us and pushed us out of these systems. So I think for me, this is about envisioning a way to do politics differently, is to be in these systems in ways that are generative, in ways that are creative, in ways that bring people along, because this isn't just about me. I'm no longer in the system. You know, I was for a long time, and I graduated in 2017. And so I'm not the one directly impacted by the policies we're passing at the table. So if I'm going to vote in support of a motion, I need to make sure that the students in our system who are going to be impacted by that vote know exactly what is happening and support the decision that I'm making. Um, yeah, I think that there's a lot of red tape in these institutions. Um, and what I've tried to model continuously is to be creative and to think about new ways of engaging with students, with these systems, with parents who have never been brought along, who don't know how any of this works. I still talk to parents who don't know what a trustee is. You know, I brought students into the board meeting. I'm into the board office for the very first time. Why is it that students in our system have never been to the board office, where a lot of decision making about their day-to-day happens? So I think for me, it's about trying to do things in a way that is different, because I think that when students are centered and when students are given the space to be centered and are being given the mic, I think we're all better off for it,
Mhm.
because they know best what their needs are and how to create responsive systems.
Yeah, no, thank you for this because I look at it like if and this goes to any students or families in all the wards in Hamilton. If they haven't been to the board office, if they haven't been to a board meeting, if they haven't met their trustee, then the system is
Mm-hmm.
failing the community, right? And I
Yeah.
see this as like insular politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Get me there, and when I get there, I'm insulated from you, right? Insulated from the community, insulated from the pressures that people see on the day to day, daily,
Mm-hmm.
all the challenges. And it's kudos to you. I really I respect the work you're doing. I think it's good for what to families and children and caregivers and advocates, like, because we really need this. And you talk about creating new futures and inclusive futures and participatory futures. So yeah, kudos to you. And so we're nearing the end of the show. So I always give the last word to the guest.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think that there's a lot that we can't necessarily control at the local level, in terms of education policy and legislation. But there's also a lot that we can control, and there's a lot that trustees can control as well. And I want to impart that on families in our board, because oftentimes I think people are told that we don't have any power. You know, so who has the power if not us? Right? And so I need parents, yeah, parents, students, nurses, to know that your trustee is supposed to be advocating for you, um, and is supposed to be representative, is supposed to act as a conduit, is supposed to make sure that your needs are being heard. And while we might not be able to always solve everything right away, you know, you still deserve the space to be heard, the space to be listened to, and you also deserve an explanation as to why things are the way they are. And so, yeah, to students, I guess, in our system specifically, know that I have your back and that I'm going to keep fighting for you, and with you, and that my DMs on Instagram are always open for folks who want to have a chat, ask questions about education, um, talk about what's going on. If they have any suggestions, you want to come by to our next board meeting. Our bleachers are often empty, except for the days when I'm bringing forward emotion. um, so it'd be nice to see people come into the chambers of where all these big decisions happen. Um, yeah, I think that in our struggle to defend public education, your voice is so necessary. So, to students who are mobilizing around all types of issues around Palestine and the occupation and demanding a ceasefire, to students who walked out around climate justice, to students who are mobilizing against the rise of fascism um, in education, know that I have your back and that we will keep fighting this together.
Yeah, thank you. This is Kojo's Corner, right at the intersection of power, people, politics, and participation. You heard it right here. I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, like maybe you should be hosting the show. uh, yeah, so for those that are watching, I highly encourage that you reach out to your trustee, you talk to them about their priorities, and you attend a board meeting. One question I have for you before you go:
Mhm.
why is there any chance the board meeting could happen at any school so that parents can attend? Like, not everybody can come up the mountain across from Lime Range to have a meeting.
Yeah, this is actually a very funny suggestion because I think Trustee White and I had actually talked about this before. Like, what are the actual rules around board meetings? And technically, we could. It just requires, some creativity and some visioning about how to make that possible. But there's nothing, as far as I understand it, there's nothing that says that the public board meetings have to happen at 20 Education Court. As long as they're public and they're open to everybody, they could happen in other places. So, yeah, if that's something parents would like to see, that's a demand that parents should totally make, and something I'm happy to bring back and see if it's possible.
Because I think about this, and I go back. Look, we are back into the show again. I think about what I said about insular politics, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
every trustee probably has high level information about the schools in their ward, right?
Mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm.
by going to other schools in other wards and seeing and talking to other parents, they will get a better sense of the whole system, right? But our insular politics just gives us this focus on just what we are concerned about. And I think that's what affects the collective decision.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
so, anyways, if you're a parent, if you're a young one listening out there, I think this needs to be done because it makes it accessible to the community.
Yeah. 100%. And that's part of our like new strategic direction is actually, I think, one of our, I mean, I don't have them memorized, but accessibility is one of the things we talk about a lot at the board office in a lot of ways. Accessibility around like language access, but also around like bringing people along. And
Hmm.
our meetings aren't accessible. Our meetings are far, in like a really fancy building, that often makes people feel,
With high
unwelcome and unsafe.
security.
Yes. Yes. But just so you know, our meetings are public, and anybody is allowed to access them without any barriers. So just keep that in mind for folks who want to come to our meetings, is that they're public as per mandated by the Education Act.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much, Trustee Sabrina. We appreciate your time, spending your time with us this evening. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And yes, so this is episode 3 done. Episode 4, we'll be talking with Amanda with United Against Hate in Brantford. So this is the first time we're leaving the geographical area of Hamilton and talking to Amanda in Brantford, and it's going to be a great discussion. Amanda was born and raised in Hamilton, and doing some important work around anti-black racism and anti-hate work in Brantford. And some of the stories she's going to be sharing with us are going to be amazing. So that's episode 4. So tune in next week, Friday, and then we will have Velma from Operation Black Vote with us, and the next guest, stay tuned, is going to be big. So thank you for tuning in, and we will see you soon.
Bye.